Welcome to History That Doesn't Suck. I'm your professor, Greg Jackson, and I'd like to tell you a story. Quamino Dolly creeps along the thin, muddy footpath that cuts through the swamp. His worn-out shoes, or maybe just bare feet, sink an inch or so into the watery earth with every step. The cold mud uncomfortably oozes between his toes, but this path is the only way to traverse the swamp, and only the locals, like him, know about it. In fact, from outside the swamp, you can't even see this path. Thick trees, likely swamp tupelo or cypress, covered in Spanish moss, enclose it, which means you can use this path to cross the swamp in secret. And that's exactly why Quamino is leading 588 of the king's soldiers on this path. Their movement is completely unknown to the Patriots, who will soon be the victims of their surprise attack. Let's zoom out a click and give you a bigger picture. It's the afternoon of December 29th, 1778, and we're just outside Savannah, Georgia. The man leading the king's soldiers through the swamp, Quamino, is a slave. In the North, many enslaved Americans are gaining their freedom by fighting for the Patriot cause. But in the South, it often goes the other way around. It's the British who are more likely to offer freedom. We have very few personal details about Quamino. In fact, all I can tell you is his name. He's black and he's enslaved. If I were a betting man, I'd wager he spent years of his life laboring on the rice plantations surrounding Savannah, and that the British have assured him he'll go free if he helps them. The men Quamino's leading along this secret swamp path are under the command of Captain James Baird. 350 of these soldiers are light infantry. The other 200 plus are loyalist volunteer soldiers out of New York. Yep, looks like Quamino isn't the only American here choosing the crown over the Patriots. Now let's zoom out a bit more. The Patriot commander protecting Savannah is a North Carolinian named Robert Howe. He's greatly outnumbered, and he knows that. But between the Savannah River, rice swamps, and bluffs, or cliffs if you're unfamiliar with that term, Robert's hoping he only need defend the city's entry point on the Savannah Road. If he can hold there, then maybe, just maybe, he can last until reinforcements arrive. So he's placed 2 brigades, one from Georgia and the other from South Carolina, totaling about 650 men, about half a mile southeast of the city along this road. It's a strong position. Still, with so few men, he's only bothering to place 100 or so Georgians to guard the rear. He's spread thin, and besides, the only way they could even get attacked back there is if the British find that one obscure, secretive footpath through the swamp. Since the British just showed up in Savannah, Robert's thinking there's no way they'll figure that out. Oh, poor Robert. If only he knew that the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, has made fast friends with Quamino and has planned a 2-part attack. Part 1, Quamino leads Captain Baird's 500-plus men on that very swamp footpath for a sneak attack. Part 2, Colonel Campbell unleashes hell on the Americans by firing his artillery and sending the majority of his men at Robert's 2 brigades on the road. Okay, now that you get the big picture, let's get back to that swamp path. As they continue on, the ground is beginning to firm up. Dry dirt and small pebbles cling to Quamino's wet feet. Still under the cover of the swamp's vegetation, Captain Baird lines up his men. They're ready to snap this plan into action. Captain Baird's 500-plus men spring from the swamp. The unsuspecting Georgian rear guard hardly have a second to respond as a force 5 times the size of their own falls upon them with muskets and bayonets. Backed by the main British forces, Redcoat Major Skelly is perched high up in a tree. He sees white smoke billowing from the Americans' rear, which tells him that Captain Baird has successfully crossed the swamp and engaged the rebels. The Major furiously waves his hat. This lets Colonel Campbell know that Captain Baird's done his part, and it's time for Phase 2 of his brilliant plan. The artillery and another 800-plus troops. Can you imagine being one of these Americans? One minute you're feeling secure, standing under the afternoon sun. Suddenly you hear musket fire behind you. Alarmed, you turn around to see hundreds of redcoats and New York Loyalists dashing towards the far smaller Georgian Guard. But then you hear artillery fire. Only a second later, large cannonballs whiz by your head, exploding your defenses while throwing debris into the air that rips through the bodies of your fellow patriots. You hear your wounded and bleeding friends scream in agony. As you turn back to the front, there's your enemy. Dressed in their plaid hats, green tartan pants, and red coats, the 71st Regiment's fearsome Highland Scots pour over the left side of your now compromised defenses. On the right, it's Hessians in blue. You're outnumbered. You're surrounded. You're done for. The Americans run for their lives back towards Savannah. They fly through the town with the British hot on their tail. All Patriot soldiers caught who prefer to go down with a fight rather than surrender are bayoneted. The Highlanders are said to be so cruel on this day that Georgian leaders will later ban all Scots who did not fight as patriots during the war from moving to the state. Ready for the casualties? 30 Americans are believed to have drowned trying to get away by swimming across the Yamacraw Creek. 83 Americans are found dead, 11 wounded. More than 450 Americans, including 38 officers, among whom is Georgian signer of the Declaration of Independence, George Walton, are taken captive. Our American commander, Robert, he started the day with over 800 men. In the end, just over 340 total evade the British. And as for the British, about 7 dead, less than 20 wounded. A confident and victorious Colonel Campbell boasts that he'll be, quote, the first British officer to rend a stripe and a star from the rebel flag of Congress. And that is how Savannah, presently Georgia's capital, fell. Welcome to the American Revolution in the South. As we close the door on 1778 and move into 1779, the South is where more and more of the action is going to be. But this is also a year full of important events that happen on the periphery and in the nooks and corners. Because of that, we need to peer into some of the corners and take a tour around the periphery, if you will. That means talking finances in Philadelphia with George and Congress, and heading to a few other places, upstate New York, Europe, and the Caribbean. Then we'll be ready to circle back to where this episode began, the South. I'll explain why the British want to take the fight below the Mason-Dixon line, and how the region's large, enslaved African-American population will bring a different element to the war than what we've seen up in the North. Oh, and don't worry, we'll slide another major battle in there too. I'll give you all the details on the British siege of Charleston. Shall we then? Let's head off on our year of nooks, corners, and the periphery, the year of 1779. To start off, we're checking in with George Washington. We left him on a pretty high note at the Battle of Monmouth. I mean, sure, the battle was a draw, but really, he came out a hero and his soldiers held their own. That's the last major battle George sees until the game ender at Yorktown. But don't think he's got it easy. He's facing something far scarier than British soldiers: Congress. While his troops make winter camp along both sides of the Hudson River, George has the displeasure of spending time with Congress in Philadelphia. Yes, after the British ended their roughly 9-month occupation, Congress returned to the city of brotherly love. And that's where George now joins them from December 1778 to February 1779. He's here to talk logistics, discourage a proposed Lafayette-led invasion of Canada, but the biggest issue is that the Continental dollar isn't worth crap at this point. Inflation is through the roof, which is part of why his men are freezing and short on supplies and food. It's hard to buy supplies with worthless money, especially when merchants can sell to the British, who have stable currency. In an effort to fight this inflation, George places his own financial well-being at grave risk. He lets those who owe money to his estate pay in Continentals, and he accepts the money at its face value. Ouch. The idea is, if he stands behind the currency, that should help it. It's heroic. I mean, seriously, find me a major politician today who'd fall so hard on the metaphorical sword in order to promote the general welfare. But of course, it can't fix the long-term issue. Before you start pining for a romanticized past, though, let me add that the Continental Congress is not joining George in these self-sacrificing efforts. In fact, George laments that, quote, an insatiable thirst for riches seems to have got the better of every other consideration and almost of every order of men. Close quote. So what's the problem? Why the inflation? Simple. The money has no backing. Congress started printing money on the understanding it would collect taxes, which would give backing to its fiat currency. But to do that, the states would have to give Congress the power to tax. I'll remind you here that many patriots envision the 13 colonies as 13 sovereign states, and therefore they have no interest in handing over the power of taxation to Congress. You see the problem? So as Congress prints its continental dollars, which have zero intrinsic value, each new dollar dilutes the currency's purchasing power. This inflates the continental dollar faster than a self-inflating emergency raft. The currency hasn't hit rock bottom yet, but it's quite low in 1779. Man. To be fair, Congress is full of the mediocre. I'm not just saying that. Its previous all-stars are either commanding the friggin' army in foreign countries like France and Spain working on treaties or other forms of aid, or, in some cases, back in their home states working on the state government. Again, remember, the states are sovereign, so they take priority over Congress in the minds of Americans in 1779. Congress, which has been waiting for the states to ratify the Articles of Confederation since 1777, is not seen as terribly important. It's where the states send their B-listers. So perhaps we shouldn't expect too much from this crowd. Over the course of the war, it's moments like these few weeks in Philly that form many of the philosophies General Washington will later use to govern as President Washington. He concludes that if these United States are going to stand together, that a simple alliance or a confederation isn't going to cut it. America has to have a stronger central government with enough teeth to actually bite on occasion. It needs a strong executive branch. It has to be able to pay for things like a national military. And to that point, it wouldn't hurt if the American economy diversified a bit. You know, having an economy where almost everyone is a farmer makes it hard to buy other goods. Someone needs to make stuff like boots, clothes, guns, etc. Now, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I will point out that George's financial guru aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton, is by his side during these years. Alex has seen the same problems from the same vantage point as George, so the seeds of Alexander's future Federalist Party are getting planted into his head right now, before your very ears. I was going to say eyes, but this is an audio podcast, so that doesn't make sense. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson's having a very different experience, and he's going to come to some different conclusions about the national economy and the virtue, or lack thereof, in having a strong national government. As you'll see later, his Democratic Republicans will eventually go head-to-head with Alexander's Federalists. Well, enough about Philly. 1779 goes on, and George impatiently twiddles his thumbs as the fighting goes on elsewhere. All the way out in Indiana, George Clark crushes it at the Battle of Vincennes. John Sullivan fights the Iroquois in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. Benjamin Lincoln goes to Georgia to fight the British. All the while, George just wishes he had the manpower to take on New York. To do so, he'd either need more Continental troops, or he'd need French Admiral Count d'Estaing to show up. Alas, the Count has been something of a disappointment since he came from France in 1778. After participating in the poorly executed Rhode Island campaign that same summer, d'Estaing took his fleet and 4,000 Marines to fight the British in the Caribbean. In late 1779, he provides support in a failed attempt to retake British-controlled Savannah, but that's about it. D'Estaing then returns to France. He never comes up north to help George. This is part of why the commander-in-chief is more or less sitting on the bench this year. He does, though, send General John Sullivan on an expedition to fight the Iroquois. This expedition doesn't play a major role in the outcome of the Revolutionary War, but since it seriously impacts the Iroquois, we should talk about it. First, the background. Like all other Americans, Indians are found on both sides of the war. The various tribes join whichever side looks to be in their best interests, just as you would expect. As such, the British find allies among the 6 Iroquois nations. While attacking with Loyalists, some of the Iroquois crossed lines in 1778 that put them on the Continental Army's radar. The 2 biggest examples are the Wyoming Massacre, where it's said the Iroquois scalped and burnt prisoners, and the Cherry Valley Massacre, where they burnt homes and killed women and children. So it's in response to these tactics that George sends General Sullivan and his 4,000 men to deliver a crushing blow. After beating the Loyalists and Iroquois in battle, Sullivan goes scorched earth. He decimates the homeland of 3 of the Iroquois nations, the Seneca, the Cayuga, and the Onondaga, destroying their orchards, grain, and rendering countless Iroquois homeless. It's a sad chapter all around. Of course, it's up to you to figure out what you think about it. Personally, I feel for both sides. I feel for the Iroquois trying to survive a war that is not theirs. I sympathize with patriot anger over the torture and death of Americans, including murdered children. I see the injustice in displacing thousands of Iroquois whose only crime is being from the same tribe as those braves who committed those acts. I also understand the Continental Army wanting to shut down the Iroquois threat so that they can use their troops and resources elsewhere. I suppose if I can say anything about this with certainty, it's this. In the long run, it's the homeless Iroquois who lost the most in this violent exchange, and they will not soon forget it. We now move from upstate New York to Europe. 1779 also sees Spain enter the war. It signs on as a French ally with the Convention of Aranjuez on April 12, 1779. Now, this is important. Spain only allies with France, not the United States. It's because entering the war can both hurt and help Spain's interests. So it's going to try to get the benefit without the drawbacks. Here's 2 ways it can hurt. 1. Unlike France, Spain still has a ton of colonies in America. It controls what will eventually become several American states, Mexico, and basically everything to the west of Brazil all the way down to the tip of South America. So I'm sure you can see why King Charles III of Spain isn't crazy about giving his colonies the idea that revolting against monarchical rule is a good thing, right? 2. Spain also knows that if the Americans win, it's going to end up competing with the United States for territory. Okay, ready for the upshot of Spain joining the war against Britain? Well, Spain, like France, is still smarting from its loss to Britain in, you guessed it, the 7 Years' War. So following the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, Spain's down with Britain losing its North American colonies. And besides, the conflict over control of the Mississippi would probably still be there regardless of whether America or Britain wins the war. But what gets Spain to actually sign on with France in 1779? Well, their agreement says France will help Spain try to recover territory previously lost to Britain. Specifically, the Floridas, yeah, it's plural at this point, the Mediterranean island of Minorca, and Gibraltar. If you don't know that last one, it's a small piece of land on Spain's southern Mediterranean coast. Spain now has a clear path to hurt Britain, possibly regain lost territory, and, since it isn't technically allying with the United States, Spain isn't directly sending the message to its colonies that it actually approves of independence movements. Not bad, huh? Well played, Charles. Well played. I'll add briefly that John Jay will spend 1780 to 1782 on a diplomatic mission to Spain, although he won't accomplish much. As you can see, Spain's already hit the sweet spot with how much it wants to participate in the war. John's attempt to get more help from Spain doesn't go far, because Spain wants him to guarantee the United States will hand over its interests on the Mississippi River. John isn't dumb enough to do that, but hey, can't blame Spain for trying. So not being an American ally, you won't see Spain sending armies to fight in the main battles of the Revolution like the French do, but it's still a subtle and important change in 1779. Why? Because even though Bernardo de Galvez only fights the British for Spain's benefit, every time he engages them in places like Pensacola, Florida, he's also lightening the Continental Army's burden by forcing Britain to allocate soldiers and resources away from the 13 colonies. Speaking of battlefields that aren't in the 13 colonies but do impact the war, let's recap the global nature of the conflict at this point. With France and Spain in the war, Britain now has to be ready for an attack anywhere from the Caribbean to Britain and even to the Mediterranean. One great example of this is the 1778 Battle of Ushant. Ever heard of it? It's a naval battle between France and Britain, no Americans, fought just off the western edge of the English Channel. Hundreds of men die. We also have privateers on the loose, which are basically pirates who have the blessing of their government to pillage. We have battles in the Caribbean. As I mentioned earlier, that's where French Admiral Count d'Estaing spends the first part of 1779. We even have French troops from Saint-Domingue, now called Haiti, that go to fight in Georgia. These Haitian troops, called Les Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue, comprise roughly 750 free men of color. If you visit Savannah, Georgia today, you can see a really impressive memorial in their honor. See what I mean? The American Revolution has become a world war. Speaking of Savannah, it's time to circle back to the South. As you heard at the start of this episode, Savannah fell to Lieutenant Colonel Campbell's invading force in December 1778. This is the beginning of Britain's Southern strategy, in which British leadership now shift their efforts in breaking the rebellion to the South. Let me explain this new Southern focus. For one, the North hasn't gone well. Remember Saratoga? And while George loses plenty of battles, he also seems to come back from the dead and land some solid blows, like he did at Trenton. You just know Christmas was never the same again for some of those Germans. Further, the entrance of France in the war last year caused British leadership to rehash their strategy, and they concluded it should take the fight to the South. Word is there are more loyalists beneath the Mason-Dixon line. Well, the South isn't as loyal as British leaders think, but they will find enough to raise a considerable number of loyalist troops. Further, the South is more valuable to Britain. See, the northern colonies make the same goods produced in Britain, but the South, with its hot and humid climate, is full of lucrative plantations producing crops difficult to grow in Britain. I'm talking about cash crops like rice, tobacco, sugarcane, and yes, cotton. But don't put too much stock on cotton yet. It's going to become a much bigger deal in the 19th century. All this is to say, British leadership thinks the South is more loyal and more valuable than those rebellious New Englanders. So why not try to establish a stronghold in the South? And hey, worst case, if they can't ever get New England under control, maybe they just cut that sucker loose. So that's the new game plan. But all that said, the fighting in the South stays minimal through 1779, even with new leadership on both sides. So that's the new game plan. But all the same, the fighting in the South stays minimal through 1779, though both sides have new local leadership. The new British commander is Augustin Prevost, or Prévost. His name shows his Swiss-French roots, and he'll do just fine until things heat up next year and the big dogs, that is, Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis, come join the party. The new American commander in the South is General Benjamin Lincoln. He's a plump, hard-working New Englander of average ability, neither good nor bad at his job. Their forces square off in a number of battles over 1779, the most consequential of which is the combined French and Continental push to retake Savannah in October. This is the battle where French Admiral Count d'Estaing comes to help and brings the troops from Saint-Domingue with him. The attempt fails, and it cost the life of Continental General Casimir Pulaski, a brave, well-respected, and valued Polish officer who fought under George Washington in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Still, despite these battles, the fighting in the South remains small potatoes throughout the whole year. So we won't dive into the details. Not just yet. There's one other American leader who heads south in 1779, and he's also a great segue into our needed discussion about African Americans and slavery in the war. This is John Laurens. We've already met John, but in case you've forgotten him, he's George Washington's South Carolinian aide-de-camp and BFF with Alexander Hamilton. Is that ringing a bell? Fluent in French, son of the President of Congress, dueled with Charles Lee? Yeah, you got him. When the fighting heads to South Carolina, he goes to defend his home state. But despite being from the South and a family up to its neck in slavery, John loathes it. He's known to encourage slave-owning patriots to free their slaves. He, like Alexander Hamilton and some others we've mentioned, see how the ideals of the Revolution call for an end to slavery. To quote John, "I think that we Americans, at least in the southern colonies, cannot contend with a good grace for liberty until we shall have enfranchised our slaves." Close quote. Bold words. And John doesn't want to wait until after the war. He wants to emancipate slaves and have them fight for the patriot cause in a regiment of free black men. John's idea isn't crazy. Many enslaved Americans, about 5,000 total, joined the patriot cause to win their freedom. They are often kept in non-combative positions, but when in battle, they usually fight right beside white troops. That segregation nonsense that will keep black and white Americans fighting in separate military units through the mid-20th century hasn't caught on yet. Still, I can think of at least one example of a regiment that is exactly what John is talking about. The Rhode Island 1st. It has about 250 soldiers, all of whom are black. And though French, not American, I already told you about the black military unit from modern-day Haiti. So 2 examples, I guess. But South Carolina and Georgia are the 2 states that do not enlist slaves to fight. Why? Well, frankly, because slavery drives the economy in the South far more than it does in the North. See, Northerners do not and cannot grow the cash crops that make slaves valuable because they lack the climate to grow these crops effectively. The difference in these economies generally means enslaved Americans are more valuable to their owners in the South because of the work they do producing cash crops. You can also see this reflected in the various states' populations. Just to stick with Rhode Island, slaves make up 6% of the population there during the Revolution. Meanwhile, in John Laurens' home state of South Carolina, they're closer to 66%. Yeah, slaves are the majority of the population. What I'm saying is, if the South gives up slavery, it will have to reinvent its economy. One other thing. Given the percentage of slaves in South Carolina and Georgia, slave owners live in constant fear of slave rebellions. It's not like they think about it all day, but it's always lingering in the back of their minds. Like a Californian worrying about earthquakes, or smartphone users fearing their screen shattering. It's a constant, low-grade background concern. And that is why South Carolinians aren't down with giving freaking muskets to slaves. Ever. And because of this effective policy, African Americans in these southern states are not going to generally be on board with the Patriots. I mean, would you be? And the British aren't stupid. They see this and take advantage of it. The British are basically saying, hey, come fight for us, we'll give you your freedom. Now, it doesn't always go this way. African Americans still run a risk in going to the British. Sometimes they aren't freed, even getting shipped off to the freaking Caribbean to die on plantations there. But, for the most part, African Americans in the South are far more likely to gain their freedom from the British, meaning that when they have to choose sides down here, like Queen O'Dolly, who showed the British that choice footpath through the swamp at the siege of Savannah, they are going to throw in with the crown. Sorry, John Laurens. Whew, that was quite the trip around the globe. Like I said, 1779 is definitely the year of periphery, nooks, corners. The impact of these events aren't as overt as major battles, but everything from finances to these small military engagements around the world are nonetheless significant. But for now, It's time to return to the main narrative and charge into one of the worst years of the war for patriots. The year of 1780. We begin this harrowing tale with the British siege of Charleston. The commander of British forces in North America, Sir Henry Clinton, hates sailing. He loathes it, even on a good day. So you can imagine how despondent Sir Henry must be as he spends roughly 2 months on the ship, getting batted around by rough waters and harsh weather. Here's how one of his Hessian captains, Johann Henrich, describes their voyage in a journal entry. Quote, January 13. Everything the same. Still a westerly wind. We cruise up and down. Terrible weather. Rain, snow, hail, storm, foaming waves, and bitter cold. Close quote. Yeah, the commander has seen better days. Sir Henry endures this misery from late December 1779 to February 1780. He's sailing with his second-in-command, Lord Cornwallis, as well as an 8,500-man army comprised of Brits, Loyalists, and Hessians. They've set out from Sir Henry's New York headquarters to lay siege to Charleston, South Carolina. I want you to appreciate the importance of this city, so let me paint you a picture of Charleston. The capital of revolutionary South Carolina, Charleston is the only real city in the relatively sparsely populated southern states. It has a rather cosmopolitan population of roughly 12,000. The majority of its inhabitants are of British descent, but you'll also find plenty of enslaved African Americans, Frenchmen, Germans, and Spaniards. The city itself consists of some 1,000 or so homes built of wood and brick. Location-wise, Charleston sits at the tip of a peninsula, with 2 rivers running on either side of it. To the east, we have the Cooper River. To the west, the Ashley River. It's also a hotbed of rebellion that helps move along Patriot supplies. In assaulting the city, Sir Henry can hope to take an important Patriot position and to build on the previous British victory at Savannah. Further, he's undertaking the first serious British offensive against the American rebels since Gentleman Johnny's 1777 disaster in Saratoga, New York. So this is kind of a big deal. Sir Henry's massive New York-based army ends their turbulent winter voyage on February 11th, 1780. They go ashore on John's Island, which is about 30 miles south of Charleston. Now, don't picture this as an isolated piece of land surrounded by blue waters. We are in a marshy area, and John's Island is in close proximity to the mainland and James Island. The Redcoats pass a miserable 10 days getting the army from John's Island to James Island, the latter of which is just across the Ashley River from Charleston. Allow me to quote Captain Johann Henrich once again, as he describes his day on February 12th. Quote, The march to headquarters was the most arduous. A column making its way through a wilderness of deep sand, marshland, and impenetrable woods where human feet had never trod. We had to struggle singly or 2 abreast through marshy and woodlands for half a mile. What a land to wage war in! Close quote. Once on James Island, they are close enough to set up headquarters and make camp. Ever careful and calculating, even to a fault, Sir Henry pauses and calls for more reinforcements as he prepares to lay siege to Charleston. As Sir Henry plots, Patriot commander of the South, Benjamin Lincoln, prepares. You may recall that Benjamin became commander of the Southern Department after the fall of Savannah in late 1778, meaning he's been here for just over a year now. He's capable as far as generals go, but with all due respect, he's not the best the Continental Army has to offer either. In some ways, perhaps it's a bit unfair, because he's received what is undoubtedly one of the most challenging commands of the war. Not only are Charleston's defenses dilapidated, but its position at the edge of the peninsula makes it difficult to defend. Further, he has a city full of civilians who for the most part are happy to rely on him for protection, but aren't willing to do a damn thing to help. That's rough. Working in these conditions, Ben sets to it, reinforcing his fortifications along both rivers and the neck to the north of the city, which is where the peninsula connects to the mainland. The city's harbor is well protected. Unfortunately, Ben doesn't get the fortifications by the neck up to scratch. To be fair, that might have been too tall of an order to expect, given his circumstances. Further, he's expecting Sir Henry to attack from the sea, not come down from the mainland. That assumption is unfortunate for Ben, because Sir Henry's already tried a sea-based attack on Charleston. He did that back in 1776. I'm guessing that's part of why he's not interested in that path. Been there, failed that. Instead, he will slowly and methodically move men and supplies north of Charleston and then descend upon it from the mainland. Now, let me add here that Charleston has the potential to turn into a trap. Ben knows it. Far away up north, George Washington knows it. Both of them see how it could play out just like that unfortunate battle at Long Island did for George back in 1776. Despite losing ground, George got lucky and was able to get most of his army out under the cover of night. So as we go on, let it be known, the Southern commander does not want to let himself get trapped, like George once did, in his own fortification. But that's exactly what Sir Henry hopes to make happen. John Laurens writes to George on March 14th detailing how he can see Sir Henry setting up this trap. Quote, "The enemy's present disposition of his force and all his late operations indicate a design to attack Charleston by a siege in form." Close quote. John also describes British transports and storeships sitting just south of Charleston at the opening of the Ashley River. John speculates that Sir Henry might undertake, to quote again, a circuitous march, fortify a camp on the neck, and open his trenches. Close quote. John is exactly right. By April 1st, Sir Henry begins digging trenches and building fortifications on the mainland's neck, about 800 yards north of the city's defenses. The Redcoats finish these within 10 days. From there, they follow a tried and true siege technique. They dig short lines towards the American defenses, then build another line of fortifications that sit parallel with their enemy's line. Rinse and repeat. This is a slow, arduous process, but it does the trick. I know we're in mid-April, but this feels like a good time to mention one other thing John said to George in his letter last April. Quote, "As the enemy is determined to proceed by regular approaches, all his operations are submitted to calculation, and he can determine with mathematical precision that with such and such means, in a given time, he will accomplish his end. Our safety, then, must depend upon the sensible arrival of such reinforcements as will oblige him to raise the siege. Your Excellency, in person, might rescue us all." Sadly, the Virginian general can't come to the rescue. George is currently sitting in winter's camp at Morristown, New Jersey, with a small, ill-supplied, and somewhat mutinous army, so he has his own problems to worry about. But seeing John reach out for external aid does tell us one thing. Ben is falling into the very same trap George did in New York. Can he make a miraculous escape too? Things grow tense over the next few weeks. The British keep digging through the wet, sandy earth, each shovelful bringing them that much closer to the American lines. But their movements are not without danger. The closer they get, the easier it is for American artillery to hit them. In their attempts to slow the British advance, the Americans fire anything they can shove in a cannon. They launch broken shovels, pickaxes, shards of glass, among other random but deadly items. Imagine being a British soldier digging under the hot South Carolina sun. It's an unusually hot April, okay? When suddenly a pickaxe comes hurling at you from some 500 yards away. Not that cannonballs are safe by any means, but this would be odd and terrifying. For their part, the British respond in kind, firing more traditional shot at the American fortifications. By late April, everyone has reason to fear and be stressed. On April 14th, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton seizes one of the few paths by which Ben Lincoln's army could still escape: Monk's Corner. Meanwhile, the lines get even closer. The Americans launch raids against the British, whose trenches are nearly right against theirs. American General Moultrie tells us that on April 24th, quote, a party composed of 300 men, Virginians and South Carolinians, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, made a sortie, that is, they attacked, upon the enemy's approaches opposite the advanced redoubts at daylight. They were completely surprised and lost about 15 to 20 men killed with the bayonet, besides 12 persons brought off on our side. Soldiers on both sides fear the worst and desert. I'm sure if the British deserters knew, though, just how desperate things are getting for the Americans by late April, they would have stuck around. On April 21st, Ben offers to surrender to Sir Henry if he can depart with his whole army intact. But the British commander knows he has him. There's no need to give such generous terms. By early May, the British trenches are literally a few mere yards from the American lines. May 9th is the final throwdown. Charleston's beautiful wood-constructed homes go up in flames as British artillery light up the city. This is it. This is the breaking point. Ben has been trapped the way George Washington wasn't. 3 days later, May 12th, 1780, Benjamin surrenders Charleston and his army of 5,500 men. Sir Henry has inflicted the greatest loss the Americans see the entire war. The Continental soldiers are made prisoners of war. The militia are released on parole. At first, the officers get to keep their swords, which might seem like a small and silly thing in the 21st century, but this is a matter of honor. However, the officers then piss the British off. "Long live Congress! Long live Congress!" they chant. For some reason, Sir Henry didn't find their chant amusing, so he takes their swords. Death and injury on both sides could have been much worse. Both the British and the Americans lose less than 100 men, respectively. As for the wounded, those figures stay under 200 for both sides. Of course, the Americans have the additional sting of losing a lot of valuable supplies, including roughly 6,000 muskets and hundreds of barrels of powder. Speaking of those 6,000 muskets, can I tell you the freak detail about this surrender? It costs more lives than the weeks-long siege. American General Moultrie tells us that as the British collect everyone's guns, they aren't particularly careful. The Americans warn the British that some of these guns are still loaded. Now, what happens when you lackadaisically throw around thousands of black powder guns near a massive store of black powder? I'll let General Moultrie take it from here. To quote him, "They threw the guns so carelessly into the store that some at last set fire to the powder, which blew up the whole guard of 50 men and many others that were standing by. Their carcasses, legs, and arms were seen in the air and scattered over several parts of the town. One man was dashed with violence against the steeple of the new independent church, which was at a great distance from the explosion, and left the marks of his body there for several days." Ugh, every time I read that, I can't help but picture this poor unnamed man thrown so high in the air by the explosion he's dashed against a church steeple. What a way to go. I don't even want to know what the, quote, marks his body left behind looked like. And can you imagine this rain of human appendages after the explosion as they come falling back to Earth? In all, 200 people die right here. I'm guessing everyone present gained a newfound respect for muskets that day. Large black powder explosion aside, we need to point out one other thing just to button up the siege of Charleston. Sir Henry leaves. He takes 4,000 troops and goes back to his headquarters in New York. He leaves behind his number 2, Lord Cornwallis, who will now take charge of the Southern strategy. Given how little they like one another, I'm sure both are happy with this arrangement. Strategically speaking, we will not top the damage done to the Patriot cause at Charleston, but shortly after, there is a much smaller battle that impacts the psychological consequences of the war. This is the battle, or rather, massacre, at the Waxhaws. American Colonel Alexander Buford and his force of roughly 400 Virginians were on their way to help support Ben Lincoln's defense of Charleston when they got word of the American commander's surrender. Clearly not able to do anything further for their fellow patriots there, Buford and his men turned back to join up with other patriot forces in North Carolina. But as they do so, Lord Cornwallis has also heard of their whereabouts. Urged on by the massive victory at Charleston, the new British commander in the South is eager to crush this rebellion already. So he sends out a loyalist unit under the command of Tarleton to cut them off and rout them. Tarleton catches up with Buford at Waxhaw Creek. This is about 9 miles away from Lancaster Courthouse, which is still in South Carolina. At this point, Tarleton tries to intimidate Buford and his men into surrendering. He sends them a message, fibbing about the numbers of his loyalist unit. He claims they have 700 men. That's nowhere near reality. They have fewer than Buford. But they do have a lot of cavalry, so that's significant. Anyhow, the message says that, quote, "If you are rash enough to reject the terms, the blood be upon your head," close quote. Now, how does Buford respond? Like a boss. Quote, "I reject your proposals and shall defend myself to the last extremity." Close quote. If Buford only knew how true that would be. Come 3 p.m., Tarleton's advanced guard catches up with Buford's rear. The battle is on. Okay, this is where things get messy. American doctor Robert Brownfield says that, quote, "Buford, now perceiving that further resistance was hopeless, ordered a flag to be hoisted and the arms to be grounded, expecting the usual treatment sanctioned by civilized warfare. This, however, made no part of Tarleton's creed." Close quote. Dr. Brownfield is referring to how Tarleton's loyalists give no quarter. That is, they show no mercy to the men who are surrendering. The doctor says Tarleton's loyalists killed disarmed patriots, and as their victims lay on the battlefield, quote, "For 15 minutes after every man was prostrate, they went over the ground, plunging their bayonets into every one that exhibited any signs of life. And in some instances, where several had fallen one over the other, these monsters were seen to throw off on the point of the bayonet the uppermost, to come at those beneath." Close quote. In case you didn't follow that, he's saying that if one guy was laying dead on top of another, they would plunge their bayonet completely through the man on top so they could also pierce the man beneath. Buford and some of his men get away, but over 100 of them die that day, with far more injured and others taken captive. Look, let me level with you on this. Dr. Robert Brownfield is giving you a very patriot version of events. The British do not see this as a massacre. And as for Tarleton, I can't say if he really is the monster the Patriots make him out to be. His horse was shot during the battle. When this happened, it collapsed on him. He was trapped. This would have made it really hard for him to stop his men from massacring. My best guess, and it's just a guess, is that Tarleton wasn't a monster. I'm also inclined to guess that the Loyalists did kill men after they had surrendered. It's very possible there were some monsters on that battlefield that day. This massacre is terrible, of course, but can I point you to an even bigger and uglier picture? In this episode alone, we have talked about 3 instances of massacre. First by the Iroquois on European settlements at Cherry Valley and Wyoming. Second by the Continental Army on the Iroquois. And third by Loyalists on their fellow colonial Americans, these patriot soldiers at Waxhaw Creek. A sad truth I've learned from history is that no single political ideology, race, ethnicity, religion, you name it, is above the worst aspects of our species. If you push a person or a group far enough and long enough, they break. You can break. And I think that's a really scary thought for most of us, because we don't want to acknowledge that the groups we belong to or that we as individuals all have a Mr. Hyde deep inside our Dr. Jekyll. Well, that was a bit heavy, but thank you as always for listening. I'm sure you know by now, History That Doesn't Suck is a bi-weekly podcast. And if you'd like to learn more about the podcast, me, or this particular episode, please visit the website historythatdoesn'tsuck.com. There you'll find links to our various social media platforms as well. If you'd like to support the show, as well as receive early access to the podcast every other week, please consider subscribing to History That Doesn't Suck at patreon.com/History That Doesn't Suck. As for next time, we have the treason of Benedict Arnold, the failure of Horatio Gates, oh, how the mighty fall, and of course, the revolution continues in the South. Join me in 2 weeks from now in episode 12, where I'd like to tell you a story.